an ignored case, a quiet village, and Miss Marple watching. Welcome to Phantom Mystery. I am Edmund Cross. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your voices make every mystery worth telling. It was a fine June afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the sort of afternoon that seemed specially designed to encourage idleness and gossip. The sun gleamed cheerily upon the white marquee set up on the vicarage lawn, where the annual church garden party was already in full swing. Teapots steamed, bunting fluttered, and the air buzzed with the comfortable murmur of village chatter, punctuated every few moments by a burst of laughter, or the clink of a teaspoon on china. Miss Marple sat in the shade of an old elm, knitting something blue and inscrutable, her sharp eyes twinkling above her spectacles as she observed the goings-on with mild amusement. She knew, as surely as she knew her own name, that no social occasion in St. Mary Mead ever passed without incident of some sort. Human nature, she often said, simply refused to be well behaved for long. Across the lawn, Mrs. Bantry, elegant as ever in her wide-brimmed hat, was talking animatedly to the vicar's wife about the difficulty of finding decent housemaids these days. Major Harper, retired from the Indian Army, was lecturing a circle of visibly trapped listeners about military discipline, while young Mr. Davies, the new schoolmaster, flirted unsuccessfully with the doctor's niece over a plate of scones. Everything was exactly as it ought to be, until the scream came. It was short and sharp, slicing through the hum of conversation like a knife. Cups rattled, and a few people dropped what they were holding. Then came a second sound, lower, strangled, unmistakably human. In the brief silence that followed, Miss Marple rose to her feet, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The crowd began to part, moving instinctively toward the source of the noise, the rose garden behind the marquee. There, half hidden by the climbing briars, lay a young woman in a pale green dress, her face ghostly white against the grass. The teacup she had been holding was overturned beside her, the liquid staining her skirt like rust. "Oh, heavens!" cried Mrs. Bantry, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth. "It's poor Lily Price, Colonel Somerton's new housemaid." Someone shouted for the doctor. Others murmured prayers or theories in equal measure. But Miss Marple, stepping delicately closer, noticed what no one else had yet remarked: the peculiar angle of the teacup handle, the faint trace of crushed petals beneath the girl's hand, and the way her lips had turned an unnatural shade of blue. "Poison," she said quietly. "I rather think it's poison." And with that simple observation, the garden party was over, replaced by a hum of fear that would soon envelop every corner of St. Mary Mead. Inspector Reed arrived before dusk, full of brisk efficiency and official suspicion. He was a tall man with the harried look of someone perpetually in a hurry to be elsewhere. To him the case appeared simple enough: a servant girl, a dose of something fatal in her tea, surely some local quarrel or foolish romance gone wrong. But Miss Marple, listening politely as he made his pronouncements, merely smiled her small knowing smile. She had already seen something that did not fit, and that, she thought, was where the real story would begin. Evening cooled the vicarage lawn, as helpers folded trestles and constables stretched a pale cord across the rose walk. Miss Marple, who had paused to seek a thimble she did not particularly require, lingered with the unhurried watchfulness of someone to whom endings are simply the part where people stop pretending. Inspector Reed moved among the last guests with his wire-taut energy, asking for exact times, exact words, exact plates of cake. He liked straight lines. Villages seldom supply them. The doctor, careful and unsentimental, had spoken of poison swift in effect, its bitter ghost dimmed by tea and sugar. Lily Price lay covered beside the briars. Near her, a cup had been placed on the low stone edging by some orderly impulse, its handle pointing left. Miss Marple kept her hands to herself, and her eyes attentive. Blue to the lips, bruised petals in the grass. A cup set down for a left hand. Trifles. Yes, but trifles that collect like dust, Where people do not think to look. A dreadful business, Mrs. Bantry said softly, joining her. Reed means to look through Somerton House from attics to cellars. Poor Colonel. He hates strangers in his cupboards. And Mrs. Finch. Oh, she will be all starch and thunder. People who love order, Miss Marple murmured, also love explanations that tidy away what will not fit. One must be careful with them. They fold facts like napkins. Along the lane, opinions arrange themselves as briskly as deck chairs in sun. Major Harper declared it the age-old tale, a jealous lad, a quarrel behind the shrubbery, a dram of wickedness. Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, found murder uneconomical. If Lily was going to leave, he remarked at the post office, anyone entangled would find relief in her absence. We'd kill her more likely. Ignorance has been the death of many. By bedtime, ignorance had become a person, and more likely a certainty. Reed gathered his facts nonetheless. Lily had poured her own tea, chosen 2 almond biscuits from a tin Mrs. Finch had brought, and spoken with Colonel Somerton about lighting a fire later in his study. The constable added that she had been seen with Tom Simmons, the undergardener, beneath the beech. Tom arrived with soil at his cuffs, and a defiant flush that made him appear guiltier than his words. I would never harm Lily, he said. We talked about a place in town. Miss Carter's cousin in Market Ledbury wants a girl in the shop. Lily liked the idea. She had Thursday penciled in a timetable. Had she promised to marry you? Reed asked, because a straight line needs its arrow. No, we walked out twice. She kept to rules. Mrs. Finch hates laughing in the passages, and Lily said rules kept her safe. I didn't want her to go, but wanting doesn't stop a train. Dismissed, Tom left with his shoulders hunched as if braced for stones. Miss Marple watched the way his hands held nothing, and thought how grief in the young chooses anger, because it does not yet know where to sit. Somerton House greeted the officials with exactness. The gravel had been recently raked. The silver in the study gleamed discreetly. Mrs. Finch opened the door like a sergeant receiving inspection. There is no poison here, Inspector, she said. My pantry is kept to a standard. Every bottle accounted for. We shall account together, Reed replied, very pleasant. Colonel Somerton appeared, stiff and careful. Daphne Somerton came down the stair with a bright scarf and reddened eyes that looked more affronted than sorrowful. We shall be in the papers, she announced. Murder at Somerton. If our creditors call at the same time, we shall be fashion itself. Daphne, her father said shockingly like a prayer. I hardly spoke to Lily, she added, glancing at Miss Marple's mild face and moderating her tone. Mrs. Finch prefers a quiet house. Lily's attic room was neat, the kind of neatness that comes from practice rather than nature. On the sill, a miniature vase held 3 sweet peas losing their colour. Miss Marple thought of the bruised blossoms in the grass. In a drawer, Reed found a railway timetable with a faint pencil mark at Thursday's 2:15 to Market Ledbury. Beside it, a torn photograph of a seaside pier and 2 mismatched buttons kept in a saucer, as if they might become a pair by patience alone. Planning to go, Reed said, satisfied. Planning invites confidences. With whom besides the undergardener? Mrs. Finch's mouth became an audit. Girls chatter. I discourage it. Lily improved under my charge, and kept her thoughts to herself, which is proper. As for Miss Daphne, young ladies are apt to be careless of those who tidy behind them. In the study, a square man waited, hat on his knees, Mr. Elford of the Motor Works, with a bill that had already called yesterday, and wished to call tomorrow. Colonel Somerton grew pink under his moustache, and produced phrases about drafts and delays. Money drafts in houses, Miss Marple knew, expose the places where the windows do not fit. By morning, St. Mary Mead had settled upon a narrative smooth as a polished banister. Tom Simmons had wanted Lily to stay. Lily had refused. Tom had slipped something into a teacup. Inspector Reed did not endorse the chorus, but he did not interrupt it either. A silence that does not protest is almost as persuasive as a shout. Miss Marple shopped as one does and let talk adhere. At the grocer's, Mrs. Lemon whispered over raisins that fair men are often darkest, and that Tom had once returned a sack of peat with language. Gardeners, Miss Marple said, own a technical vocabulary. Soil is frank with them, and they return the courtesy. She inquired whether Aunt Pratt in Brackham had been told and learned that she was stern, respectable and very sound on economies, shillings kept on a string so that they could not go wandering. At the mill, Miss Carter confessed to the ribbon that matched Lily's pale green dress. "Sixpence for the lot," she said, pink with importance. Lily liked things neat. People call that vanity when they are untidy themselves, and she didn't simper. She answered when spoken to, which certain men take as encouragement to speak again. "We see what we bring," Miss Marple agreed. Passing the vicarage on her return, she paused by the gate. The cordon had slackened under the sun. The rose walk looked as innocent as a hymn. The cup was gone, but on the stone edging a pale circle marked its rest, and below it a small scratch like a note left by a hand unpractised at pouring for others. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at that trifle of clumsiness. People reveal their nature when performing kindness. They do not often perform. They over-arrange. That afternoon Reed visited Tom's lodgings and found nothing menacing: a hymn book with a pressed fern, 2 seaside postcards, a chisel. It confirmed him, which is a danger to any inspector. First love is the worst love, he told the constable. It makes tidy boys reckless. The constable nodded because nodding is safe. Miss Marple sat by her parlour window with the geraniums and considered the arithmetic morning light struck the lace curtains of Miss Marple's parlour with that delicate honesty which exposes both dust and truth. She had slept little. Facts arranged themselves in her mind the way old lace patterns do. Loops of memory, tiny knots of connection, all requiring patience to see whole. The village, meanwhile, had already resumed its familiar rhythm. The sound of milk carts, the faint gossip hum outside the grocer's, and the subdued pride of people who have recently survived excitement. Yet under the chatter, tension persisted, a collective need to assign blame swiftly, as if conviction alone could make the poison less alarming. Inspector Reed appeared just after breakfast, his manner brisk, but his eyes drawn. He had spent the night reading statements and wished, quite sincerely, for this to be simple. Miss Marple, seeing him through the window, put down her teacup and opened the door before he could knock. "I'm afraid," he said, accepting her offer of a chair, "that the evidence continues to point toward the young gardener. Opportunity, proximity, and, well, youthful temper." "Such things point both ways, Inspector," she replied mildly. "Her temper may lead to violence, but so too may control, especially if it has been kept too long." Reed smiled wearily. "I know you like your paradoxes, Miss Marple, but we've a witness now. The vicar's maid swears she saw Tom Simmons near the tea-table minutes before the girl collapsed. Said he looked nervous." Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She adjusted a loose thread on her cardigan, then said, "Nervousness before a crime and nervousness after one are quite distinct, though often mistaken by those who enjoy telling stories." Reed gave a short laugh. "You'd have made a formidable detective, madam." "Oh, no," she said, eyes twinkling faintly. "I simply take people as they are, not as they pretend to be." He left soon after, taking his certainty with him. When the latch clicked behind him, Miss Marple stood for a while thinking. Her mind returned to Lily's cup, the faint scratch on the stone ledge, the angle of the handle, the trace of crushed flowers. A left-handed gesture, deliberate or unconscious, and the flowers pressed by someone waiting. Waiting implied knowledge of the moment to act. Later that day, she visited the Somertons under the pretext of collecting contributions for the church bazaar. Mrs. Finch met her in the hall, her expression composed but her fingers stained faintly with polish. "So dreadful," Miss Marple said, lowering her voice. "Such a shock to the whole parish." Mrs. Finch pursed her lips. A sad reflection on modern morals. The girl had spirit, too much spirit for her position. Spirit is difficult to contain, Miss Marple observed. Especially among the young. Mrs. Finch's mouth softened slightly. She was a tidy worker, I'll grant that. Never late. But she had notions. Letters, perhaps, from someone outside her station. So I warned her I did. Letters? Miss Marple's tone was mild curiosity, nothing more. The housekeeper's eyes flicked away. Nothing came of it. I disposed of one myself. Innocent enough, but written in such an untidy hand that I thought it best kept private. Kind of you, Miss Marple murmured, though in her mind a small bell chimed faintly. Disposing of another's letter was rarely an act of kindness. It was rather control disguised as propriety. Before leaving, she caught a glimpse of Daphne Somerton descending the staircase in a shawl that did not match her dress. The girl's eyes were red again, but her poise was deliberate. She greeted Miss Marple with forced lightness. Inspector Reed has been ghastly, poking about Father's study as if we harboured arsenic beside the port. Have you ever known such presumption? I dare say he is only doing his duty, Miss Marple said, though duty without sympathy is rather like a fire without warmth. Daphne gave a brittle laugh. You're clever, Miss Marple. Too clever for our dull little village. I sometimes wish I could escape it altogether. Many have thought so, Miss Marple replied gently. But wherever one goes, one brings oneself along. Outside she found Tom Simmons waiting by the gate, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked worn and frightened. They'll lock me up, ma'am, he said quietly. I never touched her tea. I swear it. Miss Marple regarded him kindly. Did Lily mention any trouble at the house? Perhaps with Mrs. Finch. She said Mrs. Finch counted the spoons twice a day. That's not trouble, only her way. But Lily, she'd found something odd, she said. A letter in Miss Daphne's room that wasn't addressed to her. Said she shouldn't have seen it, but she couldn't help reading the first line. And what was the line? Tom frowned, searching memory. Something about your debt must be settled before the quarter's end. And a name, Mr. Elford, I think. The same man that came about the car. Miss Marple thanked him and walked home slowly, her mind threading pieces together. Lily's curiosity, Mrs. Finch's destroyed letter, Daphne's carelessness and Elford's persistent calls, all tangled in a web that looked more like desperation than passion. Money, she thought, made a quieter motive than love, but a stronger one. And when debts are unpaid, poisons are purchased, if not with coin, then with silence. That evening, a chill settled over St. Mary Mead, and the wind moved through the elms with a whisper like breath drawn in fear. Miss Marple sat knitting by the fire, counting stitches and thoughts together. Her doorbell rang just as the clock struck 8. It was Colonel Somerton, hat in hand, looking older than his years. I apologize for calling so late, Miss Marple, he said. But I'm at my wit's end. The inspector suspects my household. My daughter, even. I can't bear it. Sit down, Colonel, she said kindly. I expect you're a man who believes in order. Indeed I am, he replied stiffly. The army teaches it. But this chaos, it's intolerable. Chaos, yes, she said, pouring tea. Though sometimes what we call chaos is merely the truth refusing to stay hidden. He took the cup, steadying his hand. I suppose you've heard about our financial situation. Word travels quickly. One hears things, Miss Marple said softly, though not always in the right order. He sighed deeply. The motor works account, the repairs, the mortgage, all behind. Lily overheard something between Daphne and that scoundrel Elford. My daughter tried to hush her, but the girl was frightened. She told Mrs. Finch she wanted to leave before Thursday, and Mrs. Finch discouraged it. She told her to be loyal, to think of the Colonel's good name. But Mrs. Finch takes things too far. She rules the servants like a parade ground. Miss Marple nodded, setting down her cup. Colonel, may I ask a delicate question? Have you noticed Mrs. Finch making tea for others often? He blinked. Yes, often for guests. She prides herself on her blend. She even poured for Lily that afternoon, before returning to the kitchen. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-air. Indeed, how thoughtful of her. When he had gone, the old lady sat very still. Her mind worked quietly, tracing the root of that teacup, the hand that filled it, the person it was meant for, the substitution that must have taken place. Lily had meant to serve Daphne, perhaps. Mrs. Finch had poured for Daphne's cup and set it aside. A sudden confusion, a servant distracted, a careless switch, and poison intended for one found another. Yet Miss Marple was not entirely satisfied. Poison requires motive, and housekeepers seldom act from impulse. They act from duty, and duty when misdirected can become cruelty in disguise. But whose duty had Mrs. Finch thought she was fulfilling? Outside, the church bell tolled 9, and the faint echo drifted down the street. Miss Marple rose, extinguished her lamp, and murmured to herself, "It isn't Tom, nor jealousy, nor chance. It's duty, cold and absolute, the kind that kills tidy." She drew the curtains closed, her face calm but her eyes bright with quiet certainty. Somewhere in Somerton House, a woman was tidying away a teacup for the last time, unaware that the pattern of her order had already begun to unravel. The next morning brought with it a pale mist that clung to the hedgerows, softening the edges of the village and muffling sound. It was as if St. Mary Mead itself wished to draw a curtain over the ugliness of what had been uncovered. Yet beneath the quiet there was unease. Shop doors opened later than usual. Conversations halted when footsteps approached, and even the sparrows on the church roof seemed subdued. Miss Marple noticed these little silences as she went about her errands. She had always found that people's efforts to appear calm were far more revealing than panic itself. Inspector Reed arrived again before midday, his hat slightly askew, his face drawn with the fatigue of someone who feels the shape of truth nearby, but cannot quite grasp it. Miss Marple offered him tea, though he declined with a shake of his head. "I've been to the chemist," he said grimly. "No purchase of cyanide, rat poison, or the like recorded, but we did find an empty bottle of household disinfectant under the Somerton pantry shelf. Arsenic compound. Mrs. Finch swears it was for cleaning silver." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, folding her hands together. "Silver has long demanded sacrifices." Reed gave her a look that was half amusement, half irritation. "You think her guilty?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that Mrs. Finch would consider herself innocent even if she were responsible. The distinction, you see, lies in her motive rather than her means." Reed sighed. "Motives again?" "You're right, of course. The Colonel's debts are substantial. The daughter's in disgrace, the housekeeper rules the roost, and the dead girl knew too much. But proof, Miss Marple, proof is what I must find." "Proof," she agreed, "is a very material thing, but it often grows where one least expects it." When he left, she tidied the tea things with methodical care. She could almost hear the village thinking, each household building its own version of the story. She had lived long enough to know that in such tales, the wicked were usually those of lower birth, for wickedness is always more tolerable when it wears poor shoes. But she suspected otherwise. Mrs. Finch's face, pale and polished like her silver, had betrayed not fear, but resentment, the kind born from long service and longer silence. By afternoon, she walked to the churchyard, where the vicar was tending a row of marigolds. He straightened when he saw her. "A terrible business, Miss Marple. I cannot fathom such cruelty in our midst." "Cruelty often arrives in respectable dress," she said quietly. "Tell me, Mr. Clement, did Mrs. Finch attend church last Sunday?" He blinked. "Indeed she did. She sat in her usual place, second pew from the front. She has a fondness for moral sermons, nods quite approvingly at every mention of sin. Of other people's sin, naturally." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And Miss Daphne?" "Late as usual." Whispered through the hymns with young Elford, who looked most uncomfortable. There's talk she may have been engaged to him privately. Her father, of course, would never allow such a match. "Engaged," Miss Marple repeated softly. "And engaged in debt too, perhaps, poor girl. Debt is a most persuasive suitor." The vicar, unused to her riddles, only nodded solemnly and returned to his marigolds. That evening, as dusk settled over the lane, Miss Marple's parlour grew dim, except for the flicker of her fire. She sat knitting with her usual precision, though her thoughts were far from the pattern in her hands. She imagined the scene again, the cups, the confusion, the unguarded moment when one cup was placed for another. Lily's neatness, Daphne's agitation, Mrs. Finch's authority. Somewhere in that trifling dance of tea and propriety, the poison had found its mark. At 8 o'clock a knock sounded at her door. It was Daphne Somerton. Her shawl was drawn tight, her expression a mixture of defiance and fear. "I shouldn't be here," she said quickly, glancing behind her. "Father doesn't know I've come." "Then it must be important," Miss Marple said gently, leading her inside. "Sit down, my dear. There's cocoa on the hob." Daphne hesitated, then took the offered cup with trembling fingers. "They're saying dreadful things about me. That Lily died because of some foolish letter that I meant harm to her. But it's not true. I did write to Mr. Elford about the money Father owes him. I begged for time. Lily must have seen the letter. She confronted me that morning, said she'd tell Father unless I explained everything. She thought she was helping. And then she went to Mrs. Finch." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "and Mrs. Finch prides herself on discretion." "Yes," Daphne said bitterly. "She told me she'd take care of it, that servants oughtn't meddle in family business. I thought she only meant to dismiss Lily, but when I saw Lily lying there—" Her voice broke and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Mrs. Finch looked almost relieved. Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her arm. "You've done the right thing, my dear, in speaking of it. Truths left unsaid tend to rot." Daphne swallowed hard. "Will you tell the inspector?" "In time," Miss Marple said softly. "But first there's something I must see for myself." After Daphne left, Miss Marple fetched her shawl and walked through the chill night toward Somerton House. Lamps glowed faintly in the downstairs windows. She found Mrs. Finch in the kitchen, wiping down a spotless counter, her movements precise as a ritual. "Working late?" "I see," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "One must keep standards," Mrs. Finch replied. "Murder or no murder, the silver will not clean itself." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward a shelf where bottles gleamed faintly. "I was just admiring your polish. Arsenic-based, is it?" Mrs. Finch froze for a moment. "The old formula, yes. Perfectly harmless when diluted." "I imagine so," Miss Marple said mildly, "though one must be careful which dilution is served to guests." The housekeeper turned sharply. "If you're implying—" "Oh, I never imply," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I observe. You see, the cup Lily drank from bore traces of polish around the rim. Not much, just enough to suggest it had been wiped hastily with a cloth used for cleaning. And Lily, being neat, would never serve with such carelessness. I fancy she reached for Miss Daphne's cup by mistake." Mrs. Finch's lips thinned. "Idle talk. You've no proof." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but you will find the inspector has a talent for proof once shown the path. I imagine you meant only to frighten Miss Daphne, to make her ill, perhaps, remind her of her duty to her father's house. Servants can be so fiercely loyal even to the wrong people." Mrs. Finch's eyes flickered just once, and that was enough. She turned back to her polishing, her voice flat. "Loyalty is not wrong. A household must be kept together, even at the cost of a life?" The woman did not answer. When Miss Marple returned home, the church bell struck 10. She closed the door behind her and exhaled slowly, feeling the chill of night sink into her bones. She knew Reed would need the morning to act, to question, to collect the bottle that still gleamed innocently on that kitchen shelf. For now the village slept uneasy, and in the silence, Miss Marple thought of Lily Price, young, tidy, and unlucky enough to have served a household where duty had curdled into poison. Outside, the mist thickened, wrapping St. Mary Mead in quiet deceit once more, as though the village wished to hide its shame beneath a shroud of gentility. But Miss Marple knew that morning would come, and with it, the truth. Morning returned pale and damp. a veil of rain softening the outlines of St. Mary Mead. The village wore a hush that was neither grief nor calm, but something suspended. Between the uneasy quiet of people, waiting for a verdict they already half believed. In Miss Marple's parlour, the air smelled of toast and lavender polish. She sat by the window, hands still for once, watching a postboy splash along the lane. The pattern of events had begun to take shape in her mind. The confusion of cups, the household ruled by discipline instead of warmth, and a death that had arrived like a misdelivered letter. Yet she knew better than to think understanding and proof were the same thing. Proof must be coaxed, like a secret that wishes to stay silent. At 9 o'clock a knock came, brisk and heavy. Inspector Reed stood there, coat beaded with rain, his expression sharper than usual. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "you were right about Mrs. Finch. We found traces of arsenic polish in her cupboard, enough to make a regiment ill. She denies everything, of course, says the bottle was old stock and that she's being framed. But her hands were trembling when I mentioned the cups." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "She trembles because she believes herself righteous, Inspector. That sort of conviction never doubts. It only fears being misunderstood." He stepped into the room, lowering his voice. "We've taken her to the station for questioning. Colonel Somerton's furious, claims she's incapable of harm. Says she's been with the family 30 years, practically raised his daughter." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "and that's the tragedy of it. A woman like Mrs. Finch does not kill from hatred, but from love. The wrong kind of love that seeks to control rather than protect." Reed looked at her curiously. "You speak as if you pity her." "In a way I do. She meant to save the family's honor, not destroy it. But poison, Inspector, is never so precise as its giver imagines." He drew a breath, studying her face. "There's something else. Daphne Somerton's vanished. Left the house early before the constable arrived. Her father claims she went for a walk, but her room's empty. No shawl, no gloves, nothing. I don't like it." Miss Marple rose at once, setting aside her knitting. "Nor do I. When guilt is shared, one often runs and the other hides." They walked through the drizzle toward Somerton House, the gravel drive shining like a river of glass. Colonel Somerton met them at the door, looking harried and older, his dressing gown unbuttoned. "I've told you," he said tightly, "Daphne needed air. This inquisition has worn her to the bone. You've no right to treat us like criminals." "None at all, sir," Reed said evenly. "But until your daughter returns, I must assume she's avoiding something." Miss Marple's gaze drifted past the colonel into the hall. A faint draught stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of damp roses. She noted the umbrella stand, one space empty, the smallest parasol missing. A detail, but details were her profession. "I believe, Colonel," she said gently, "that Miss Daphne may have gone toward the churchyard. It offers solitude without distance, a place to think without truly leaving." The colonel frowned. "The churchyard? At this hour?" "Even the guilty seek grace in familiar places," she murmured. Reed hesitated only a moment before turning on his heel. They followed the muddy path toward the church, rain soft on their faces. As they neared the lich gate, Miss Marple saw a flicker of colour. Daphne's blue shawl draped over the bench beside the old yew. The girl sat hunched, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale against the dark leaves. "Miss Daphne," Reed said, stepping forward. "You've given us a fright." She looked up slowly. "I couldn't stay there. The walls were listening." Her voice was low, frayed by exhaustion. "You've taken Mrs. Finch, haven't you? Father will never forgive me. He says I've betrayed the only decent woman in the house." "No one has betrayed anyone," Miss Marple said softly, approaching her. "But I think you've something to tell us, my dear." Daphne's eyes filled and she turned away. "It was my fault," she whispered. "All of it. I told Mrs. Finch about the debt. I begged her to help me keep it from Father. She said she would handle Mr. Elford, that she could make him back down." "I didn't know what she meant." Reed's jaw tightened. "You're saying she planned to poison Elford?" "Yes. She said he'd been coming too often, asking questions, threatening to call the bank. She mixed the polish that morning, said she'd teach him humility. But then Lily brought the tea early before Elford arrived. Mrs. Finch must have left the cup on the tray. Lily swapped it when Daphne's fell. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "And you saw?" Daphne nodded miserably. "I saw her face when Lily drank. It was only a flicker, but she knew. She knew the wrong person had taken the cup. I think she meant to tell me later, to explain it as an accident, but she never got the chance. She's been watching me ever since, like a hawk afraid I might scream the truth aloud." Reed's notebook was forgotten in his hand. The rain hissed softly through the yew branches. "Why didn't you tell us before?" he asked. "I couldn't," Daphne said. "Mrs. Finch made Father believe she'd kept the household together after Mother died. He trusts her more than he trusts me. And I thought, if she confessed, the scandal would ruin him." Miss Marple laid a hand on her arm. "My dear, scandal is temporary. Murder is not." For a long moment only the rain spoke. Then Daphne rose unsteadily, her face pale but resolute. "You'll find the rest in her cupboard," she said. "A small wooden box wrapped in linen. She keeps the old letters there, the ones she took from me. She said they'd remind her of my weakness." Reed signalled to the constable waiting at the gate. "Fetch it," he said curtly, "and tell them to hold Elford for questioning. I want to know what threats he made and how far this business went." Miss Marple watched as the girl was led back toward the house, the parasol drooping in her hand. When they were alone, Reed turned to her. "So it's as you thought, duty gone wrong. She tried to poison the man who endangered her master's honor, and killed the maid instead." Miss Marple's expression was distant. "Yes, but it isn't quite finished, Inspector. There's still the question of why Mrs. Finch kept silent afterward. A tidy mind would have explained it as accident, sought forgiveness. But she didn't. She waited. She watched. That suggests fear, not of discovery, but of someone who already knew." Reed frowned. "You mean the Colonel?" "Perhaps. Or someone he protects. People who depend on order can bear no disruption, even from conscience. They return through the dripping trees, their boots leaving shallow prints in the soft earth." The lamps of Somerton House glowed through the mist, steady and watchful. Inside, the air smelled faintly of starch and polish. Reed sent a man to retrieve the box from Mrs. Finch's quarters. Within minutes he returned, holding a linen bundle. Reed unwrapped it carefully. Inside were letters, some to Daphne, some written in a hand unmistakably masculine, all signed with the same name, A. Elford. Miss Marple bent to read a fragment of one. "Our arrangement stands until your father's debt is cleared." "You know what must be done," she sighed. "So that's it." He held her with money and hinted at ruin. Mrs. Finch, seeing her young mistress trapped, decided to intervene in her own merciless way. Reed stared at the letters. "For pity she'll hang for it." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Perhaps. But punishment and justice rarely coincide neatly, Inspector. Sometimes they pass one another in the night. By evening, word had spread quietly through the village. Mrs. Finch was charged, Colonel Somerton confined to his study, and the church bells rang out not for joy but habit. Life in St. Mary Mead began to restore its surface calm, though the calm was thinner now, like porcelain strained by heat. Miss Marple sat once more by her window, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Beyond the hedge, she could see the faint flicker of lamplight from Somerton House. She thought of Lily Price, bright, hopeful, careful, and of how quickly careful lives are broken by other people's certainties. The rain ceased, leaving the air washed and clean. Somewhere a nightingale began to sing. Miss Marple smiled faintly, a small weary smile meant for no one. Human nature, she reflected, was much the same as her garden. It bloomed prettily enough, but beneath the petals there were always thorns, always roots twisted together in secret. And the gardener's task, her task, was never truly done. Rain-washed light visited the village with a fragile propriety, as if the skies themselves had remembered their manners after the previous day's agitation. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual and wrote 2 lines on a slip of paper. Intention, accident. She left it on her mantel, as one leaves a crumb for a returning thought, and went to the window. Somerton House showed no movement beyond drawn curtains. The arrest had quieted tongues for an evening, but quiet in St. Mary Mead is a staging area. It never means peace. She poured tea, tasted it, and thought of Lily's cup. The faint polish on the rim, yes, but more importantly, the quickness of death and the little blue at the lips. Arsenic is ponderous, it gnaws. What had visited Lily was fleet. Bitter almonds floated through Miss Marple's memory, the biscuits Mrs. Finch had brought, the old tale of prussic acid's ghostly scent. Such a scent could vanish under a sugared disguise, so even a doctor's trained sense might hesitate if a garden party reeked of marzipan and roses. Inspector Reed arrived near 10, his hat brim shining with last drops of rain, his step brisk but not triumphant. Triumph had fled him overnight. Miss Marple could see that. He took her chair without ceremony. "The doctor's report is not complete," he said, "but the preliminary findings don't please me. There's a suggestion, don't ask me how sure, that the poison may not be arsenic at all." He watched her face and found no surprise there, which both annoyed and steadied him. "There were almonds at the table," he went on. "That complicates what witnesses think they smelled. But the speed, he's leaning toward hydrocyanic acid, cyanide." Miss Marple merely nodded. "Then Mrs. Finch is wrong. Not innocent, no, not that, but wrong. Her cupboard explains her soul, not the death." She folded her hands. "She intended one kind of harm and achieved none. Someone else achieved another entirely." Reed rubbed a line on his forehead with a forefinger, as if he might erase it. "Then I must untangle intent from effect. I dislike philosophy before luncheon." He stood. "I'll speak with the doctor again, and with Elford. If cyanide entered our story, he's the likeliest source. There's plating solution at the works, and men who repair engines learn tricks with harsh liquids. He threatened, he pressed, he would be pressed back." A knock forestalled him. A constable burst in, breathless from haste and apology. "Sir, Mr. Elford, down at the works. Found in his office, smell like almonds, they say." The clerk kicked the door when he didn't answer. "He's dead." Silence followed, not heavy but taut like the held note of a violin. Reed's eyes cut to Miss Marple's. Hers held neither triumph nor dismay, only the grave assent one gives to inevitability. "We go," he said tersely. The motor works crouched on the far side of Market Row, all spattered glass and tin and the purposeful ugliness of modern enterprise. Men had gathered in clumps that broke apart at the sight of officialdom, reforming into straight lines and swallowed words. The office door, painted a gentlemanly green, stood wedged open by a toolbox. Reed stepped inside. Miss Marple waited in the threshold's shadow as she often did, where observation has the best light. Elford sat collapsed sideways in his chair, mouth slightly open, eyes glazed with that surprised indignation of the newly dead. A small cup rested near his hand, a dark sediment collecting at its base. On the blotter lay a half-written note, a column of figures, an unfinished A, his initial, trailing away into a scratch. Reed gestured the doctor forward, listened to murmurs about pupils, breath, the hour of death. "Less than an hour, probably half," the doctor judged. "Smell present, strong. Fits with prussic acid." He pointed at the cup. "Tea sweetened. Those who mean to die seldom sweeten. If this was suicide, it had sugar's courtesy." "Who brought him tea?" Reed snapped to the foreman. The foreman removed his cap with a hand that felt for courage the way one checks for a pocket-knife. "Miss Daphne Somerton, sir. Early she came. Said she wished to settle an account and would see him alone. She brought a flask. Poured for him here, then left, quick-like." 5 minutes later the clerk heard a thud. Reed did not look at Miss Marple. He did not need to. "Find Miss Daphne," he said. "Gently," to the doctor. "Do not touch that cup. Miss Marple studied the desk. Elford's letters had a back-slanted hand, the leftward lean of a writer whose wrist had long resisted imitation. She remembered the curves in the seized bundle and saw them echoed in the aborted A on the blotter. Left-handed. On the tray by the window, a saucer sat with its handle pointing left, as if expecting the diner's grip. She found the small comfort of confirmation unsatisfying. Left-handedness had been the first clue at the garden party. The cup's handle set wrong for a right-handed housekeeper. Mrs. Finch had arranged for a left-handed man, but Lily had not been the left-handed man. She had been order mistaken for intention, as so many neat girls are. Reed came back with his mouth a thin line. "Daphne is at home," he said. Pale, coherent, insistent, she brought tea because Elford preferred her taste. She claimed she laid the flask on the desk unopened while he talked. He poured his own cup. "She swears she touched nothing else." "Men who enjoy power," Miss Marple said softly, "often insist on pouring. It proves nothing except their habit." The inspector's glance slid to the window, where damp light made a wavering pattern on the sill. "We'll have the flask tested. The cup, too. If she brought the poison, we'll know." He paused. "I had Mrs. Finch. Now I have Miss Daphne. God save me from tidy answers that turn to sand." They left the office to the quiet industry of death. Outside, a boy wheeled a bicycle slowly past the gate, starstruck at a story losing its first actor and finding a second. Miss Marple and Reed walked back along the lane. He spoke first. "It might be simple," he said reluctantly. "Daphne broke. She thought to end the debt and the danger. If Finch failed, the girl succeeded. One act of loyalty begetting another, both corrupt." Miss Marple shook her head. "No. Miss Daphne has many faults. She is careless with time and careless with shawls, but she is not careless with the difference between mischief and murder. She might dream of escape. She would not drink Freedom's stirrup cup from the devil's cellar. Besides, if she meant to kill him, why come so early? Why bring a flask into a place full of cups? And why most of all choose today after Mrs. Finch was taken? Guilt does not time itself to an inspector's schedule." Reed gave a short, tired laugh. "Then who?" "Someone who could reach both scenes," Miss Marple said, more to herself than to him. "Someone who knew about the polishing bottle and allowed it to stand as a curtain, and who also knew Elford's habits at his desk. Someone with a tidy soul who hides disorder in other people's sins." She looked up at him. "I should like to speak with Colonel Somerton." The colonel received them stiffly, but stiffness falters when gravity arrives. Reed told him the news. The man took it as soldiers take musket balls, to the chest without theatrics. "Dead," he said, and closed his eyes. "Then the debt is settled in blood." When he opened them, they were not a father's eyes or a debtor's eyes, but a commander's. "What do you require?" "Truth," Miss Marple answered without gentleness. "Did you know of Mrs. Finch's plan for Elford?" "No," he said quickly, too quickly, then moderated his tone. "She hinted she would manage him. I assumed a rebuke, a threat to speak to the bank on our own terms. And this morning," Reed added, "your daughter went to him with a flask. Did you bid her?" Somerton's nostrils flared. "I did not." He paced the length of the rug and back, the movement of a man polishing his thoughts to a shine. "But I knew she would. She has her mother's courage without her mother's caution. I forbade it. She went." His voice roughened. "Reed, consider. If Daphne intended murder, would she go alone? Would she return at once? Would she deny nothing?" "Some do," Reed said. "The innocent and the foolish share one trait. They tell the truth at inconvenient times." Miss Marple's gaze strayed to the mantel. On it stood a silver-framed photograph of Mrs. Somerton in a field of heather, a parasol at tilt, held in the left hand. Beside it a plain lacquer box with a little chip near the latch, as if a hand's ring had worn a mark there over years. She remembered the letter she had seen in Elford's bundle. "You know what must be done. Debt breeds imperatives in weak men and in strong women alike." "Colonel," she said quietly, "forgive me. Were you ever a photographer?" Your wife's portrait is an amateur's pride, not a studio's. Did you keep chemicals? The Colonel blinked. Years ago. Plates in India. Nothing since. Cyanides for fixing baths. I remember the reek. We have none here. And yet, Miss Marple murmured, St. Mary Mead has a schoolmaster with a fondness for lantern slides, and a vicar who borrows his apparatus for fêtes. Chemicals borrow owners when people are careless. So many hands to pass a bottle along. Reed straightened. Mr. Davies, he said, the schoolmaster. He flirted with the doctor's niece at the party. He might have refilled a little phial from a bigger one and tucked it in his pocket as carelessly as he tucks chalk behind his ear, Miss Marple finished. But motive, Inspector. He needs one, and a good one. Somerton sank into a chair. If Elford is dead, the account ledger will be examined. Partnership's liabilities. You will find my name where it does not belong. He made a bleak sound. Elford advanced little sums to little men around here. Davies included, I suspect. A bicycle, a radio, a promise to be paid from their wages. He liked strings. Strings, Miss Marple repeated, hearing in the word the humming of wasp nests and the snap of a kite line in sudden wind. Then Mr. Davies had cause to fear exposure, if Elford spoke aloud. But did Lily stand between him and safety? What did she see? The room seemed to narrow around them. Outside, a cart rattled, the ordinary world insisting on itself. Miss Marple felt the structure of the thing settling, not finished but recognizable, like a lace pattern after the first rose, position, repetition, a motif about to declare itself. Colonel, she said very gently now, who else in this house uses the study in the mornings? He looked puzzled. Only myself. And Mrs. Finch to dust. Daphne hardly steps inside. But Lily did, Miss Marple said. She lit the fire for you after tea, remember? That is what she told the constable, before she died. She turned to Reed. The study key, Inspector. Who kept it and who borrowed it and on what days? A routine murder is committed by someone who knows routines. Cups at 4, ledgers at 9, keys at 11. We must follow the pattern, not the panic. Reed nodded slowly, as a man learning a new drill. I'll fetch the schoolmaster and the vicar. Question the chemist about small bottles. Look into ledgers at the works. And the key book here. He glanced at Somerton. You'll assist. I cannot bear it, the Colonel said, but his voice had become the voice of duty again. Therefore I shall. Miss Marple rose. And I shall have a word with the vicar's maid, the one who saw Tom by the tea. She sees more than she says. Maids often do. If she noticed a left hand at the cups, she might have thought it politeness, not purpose. She smiled, faint and tired. We will let human nature lead us, Inspector. It is untidy, but it seldom lies. The next day dawned sharp and cold, the sort of morning when frost drew its thin lacework over every window pane, and even the sparrows seemed reluctant to speak. Miss Marple, bundled in her shawl, sat by her fire with a single candle burning beside her. Its flame trembled in the draught from the chimney, but her thoughts did not waver. The pattern was nearly visible now. Threads that had seemed scattered and contradictory were pulling tight around a single chilling truth. What had begun as a single poisoned cup had spread into a tangle of fear, deceit, and desperate protection. Inspector Reed arrived early, as if impatience could make clarity come sooner. His boots carried the crisp smell of outside air, and he brought with him the strained alertness of a man who'd slept little. Miss Marple, he said, removing his hat, we've spoken to the schoolmaster, Davies. He admits to handling photographic chemicals, but swears nothing left his classroom. The chemist confirms a small bottle of potassium cyanide missing from his stock, though unaccounted for in his records. People rarely steal poison, Miss Marple said quietly, unless they think it's for someone else's good. Reed frowned. That's a dangerous kind of good. The worst kind, she agreed, because it always imagines itself righteous. He sighed and glanced toward the window. Mrs. Finch refuses to speak further. She's maintaining that she meant to set things right. As for Colonel Somerton, he insists his family's name mustn't be dragged through scandal. I've known obstinate men before, but he may win the prize." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Pride is a tidy thing, Inspector. It prefers locked cupboards to open windows." She rose, taking her shawl. "Let us visit the school, shall we? I should like to see Mr. Davies's classroom." The schoolroom smelled of chalk, damp coats, and ink. Sunlight fell in watery strips across the long desks, catching dust that hung like faint smoke. Mr. Davies stood stiffly at his lectern, spectacles slipping down his nose, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he greeted them. His eyes darted from Reed to Miss Marple and back again. "I understand you're fond of photography," Miss Marple said kindly. "Such a fascinating pastime. My nephew dabbled once. He used cyanide for fixing plates, I believe." Davies nodded, swallowing. "A very small amount, Mrs. Marple, but I haven't touched any in weeks." The bottle was kept locked. "It could have been borrowed, I suppose. We sometimes share supplies with the vicar for his slide lectures." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the cupboard at the back of the room. "And who holds the key?" "The vicar does," Davies said after a pause. "He keeps it for convenience. His lectures are regular, mine only occasional." Reed scribbled in his notebook, muttering, "Another key. More borrowed property." Miss Marple studied the teacher's hands. Ink smudged the left cuff. His fingers bore faint stains of developer. She remembered the left-handed cup at the garden party, the same mark of use. "You write with your left hand, Mr. Davies?" He blinked. "Yes, always have." "Curious," she murmured. "How many small accidents begin with the left hand? One wonders whether God meant us to trust it." They left him pale and uneasy, his pupils whispering as the door shut behind them. Outside, Reed exhaled sharply. "You think he did it?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that he knows who did, and that he is frightened, though not of prison. So of someone nearer." Reed frowned, walking beside her through the frosty lane. "Nearer? You mean the Colonel? Or the vicar?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Fear born of conscience has a different shape than fear of punishment. Mr. Davies looks not at his enemies, but at his own threshold. There is someone he cannot betray without shattering what remains of his peace." By afternoon, the frost had melted, leaving the roads slick and dark. At the vicarage, the housemaid, the same girl who had glimpsed Tom Simmons near the tea-table, met them at the door. She looked wary but not hostile. Miss Marple's kindness disarmed her almost at once. "Such a terrible time," the maid said in a rush. "No one knows what to think. Mr. Davies came here that morning before the garden party. He said something about the vicar's lantern slides and borrowed a key. He was in a hurry, I remember, because he nearly dropped his camera bag on the step." Reed stiffened. "So he had the key after all." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on the maid's arm. "My dear, do you recall whether he returned it?" The maid hesitated. "Later that day, I think. Or maybe the next. I was dusting the hall when he came in. He looked flustered, pale. He handed me the key and said to give it to the vicar. But the vicar was away in Ledbury, so I put it on the study table. Mrs. Finch came by that evening, collecting donations for the fete. She went into the study for a moment, said she wanted to leave an envelope for the vicar." Reed's pen scratched furiously. "Mrs. Finch had access to the key, the cupboard, and the poison." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and the mind to use it, but not the foresight to realize she was being used herself." The maid looked puzzled. "Used, ma'am?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, yes. Kindness and piety make splendid disguises for deceit. One can convince almost anyone to sin if one calls it sacrifice." They left soon after, Reed muttering under his breath about saints and devils. As they neared the corner of the lane, Miss Marple paused abruptly. "Inspector," she said softly, "there is still something missing. Mrs. Finch may have had the poison, but she had no reason to act on the very day of the party. Someone must have prompted her." Reed frowned. "The Colonel?" "No, he wanted quiet, not chaos. Someone else pressed her, subtly. Someone she trusted. Someone who needed Elford silenced but not yet by law. Mr. Davies had motive and access, but not courage. Mrs. Finch had devotion and fear, but not cunning. Yet the arrangement between them, whether they knew it or not, was perfect. One supplied the means, the other the act. Reed looked astonished. "You mean they worked together?" "Not knowingly," Miss Marple said. "Human beings rarely conspire as they imagine. One sets the table, another brings the poison, and a third pours the tea, all believing they serve different masters." The inspector rubbed his temples. "Then who poured the tea at the garden party? You said Lily's cup was misplaced." "Mrs. Finch poured," Miss Marple replied. "But someone else brought the tray. Someone who noticed the cup marked for the left hand, and switched it, perhaps idly, perhaps in confusion. Who would do such a thing? Someone accustomed to correction but unaccustomed to command." Reed's eyes widened. "Tom Simmons." "Yes," Miss Marple whispered. "He changed the cups to please Mrs. Finch, aligning the handles as she preferred, rightward, not left. A servant's habit. By trying to be neat, he sealed Lily's fate." They walked on in silence, the weight of the truth pressing between them. "Then," Reed said finally, "Lily died by mistake, Mrs. Finch killed without intent, and Mr. Davies supplied the poison without knowing it." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Precisely. Yet none are wholly innocent. Human folly, Inspector, makes murder of accidents and accidents of plans. There's still one matter, though, Elford's death. That was no accident. Whoever finished him did so deliberately, to silence the chain before it broke." Reed stopped dead. "Then who?" Miss Marple's eyes met his, calm and unflinching. "Colonel Somerton," she said softly. "A man who has lost too much pride will kill to preserve what remains. He knew Elford's threats would surface, knew Mrs. Finch's confession would bring ruin, and so he acted, cleanly, efficiently. Cyanide is a soldier's poison, swift and final. He poured it into the cup himself under the guise of hospitality." Reed stared at her. "You think you can prove it?" "I think," she said, "he will prove it for us. Men who live by order cannot abide unfinished business. He will come to us, Inspector, perhaps not today, but soon, and he will explain, as all tidy men do, precisely how he made the mess right." The frost returned that evening, silvering the hedges once more. Miss Marple sat by her fire, listening to the creak of the timbers and the distant toll of the church bell. Somewhere in the darkness, truth was preparing to step into the light. Evening crept over St. Mary Mead like ink, dissolving into water, quiet at first, then thick and full of shadow. Lamps glowed behind drawn curtains, and the air smelled faintly of coal smoke and the damp sweetness of fallen leaves. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the fire whispering low. On the table before her lay 3 small objects: a scrap of linen torn from Mrs. Finch's apron, a chipped teacup handle wrapped in paper, and a letter folded once, its crease precise and old. Each was a fragment of a life already unravelling. She touched none of them. She had learned long ago that touching a clue too soon was like prodding a wound. It closed wrongly. Inspector Reed arrived just before 7:30. His face, lean and set, wore the look of a man trying not to see what he already knows. He removed his gloves slowly. "It's begun," he said. "Somerton sent a note to the station, asks to see me privately. Said it concerns the true shape of the matter. I thought I'd better stop here first." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the fire. "Yes, he's preparing his statement, though he won't call it that. Men like the Colonel must confess as though giving orders." Reed managed a tired smile. "You always seem 2 steps ahead. Only one, Inspector. And sometimes only because I look where people dislike to look." He hesitated, then said quietly, "You really think he did it?" "Elford's murder, I mean." "That he finished what began with Mrs. Finch." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap. "Yes, pride is the last refuge of those who have lost everything else. When Elford died, the Colonel believed he was preserving his world, but he forgot that guilt, once born, will not stay quiet. It scratches under the door until it's let in." Reed rubbed his chin. Then this meeting may end it. Endings, she murmured, are never tidy things. They are merely the moment when truth stops pretending to be polite. They found Colonel Somerton in his study, standing beside the fire with his back to them. The light threw his shadow long across the carpet, a tall silhouette made frail by stillness. He turned when Reed closed the door, and for the first time his composure seemed worn thin. His hair was unbrushed, his tie crooked. On the desk lay a pistol, not pointed, merely waiting. "Inspector," he said, his voice steady but low. "Miss Marple. I had a feeling you'd come together. Appropriate, really. The lady for conscience, the gentleman for law." Reed's tone was careful. "You asked for me, Colonel." Somerton inclined his head. "Yes, I've written it out. I thought that best. My mind's too tired for long speeches. But there are things I prefer said aloud." He gestured to a paper on the blotter. His hand trembled once, then steadied. "I won't have my daughter branded as a conspirator, or that woman, Mrs. Finch, hung as a common poisoner. She was loyal to a fault. It was I who finished it." Reed moved closer. "You gave Elford the cyanide." Somerton nodded. "He'd been pressing me for weeks, hinting at exposure, threatening my name. When Finch was taken, I knew he'd talk. He already suspected she'd tried for him once. I invited him that morning, told him we'd come to an agreement. I poured the tea myself." He smiled. "The man had the arrogance to think victory polite." Miss Marple watched the firelight tremble in his eyes. "And did you feel justified?" He looked at her sharply. "I felt necessary. There's a difference. A soldier learns it early. Duty before consequence. I thought I could do one more necessary thing." His voice cracked on the word thought. "But it doesn't leave you, you see. It sits in the room with you afterward. It breathes when you can't." Reed stepped forward, his tone almost gentle. "Colonel, you understand the law won't—" "Yes," Somerton interrupted, raising a hand. "Spare me that, Inspector. I understand. I've written enough orders in my life to know what must follow disobedience." He looked toward Miss Marple then, almost pleading. "You at least will see that my daughter isn't stained by this. She's a foolish girl, but not wicked." "She will not suffer for your pride," Miss Marple said softly. "But truth demands its due, Colonel. Not vengeance, just truth." He gave a weary smile. "Truth? Yes, I suppose that's all that's left." He took the pistol from the desk, held it loosely, almost absently. "A soldier's gesture, you understand. I couldn't bear the indignity of a trial." Reed's voice hardened. "Put it down, sir. There's been enough death." Somerton's gaze met his unflinching. "You're right, of course." He placed the weapon gently on the blotter, beside his confession, and turned toward the fire. "But you'll allow me one moment alone, Inspector. A man should at least close his own door." Reed hesitated, but Miss Marple spoke before he could answer. "No, Colonel. Leave the door open. Darkness never improves honesty." For a moment, he looked as though he might protest, but then something in her calm defeated him. He nodded once, shoulders sagging. "Very well." When they left the study, Reed sent the constable to fetch a doctor. The sound of the colonel's voice murmuring within, low, almost prayerful, followed them down the hall. Then came silence. Miss Marple stopped at the threshold, listening. "He won't take the easy way," she said quietly. "He wants to be punished. It's the last proof he can still command himself." Reed glanced back uneasily. "Do you think he'll hold to that?" "Yes," she replied, "but he'll ask to see his daughter first. That's where the danger lies, not in the pistol, but in despair." They waited in the drawing-room while the constable fetched Daphne. She arrived pale, tearful, her shawl clutched tight around her. When Reed told her her father wished to see her, she shook her head violently. "No, I can't. He looks at me as if I'm her mother, I mean. It frightens me." Miss Marple took her hand. "My dear, you must go. He needs to hear that forgiveness is possible. It's the only mercy left to him now." Daphne's lips trembled. "I'm afraid." "Courage isn't absence of fear," Miss Marple said gently. "It's doing what's right despite it." The girl nodded barely and went with the constable. The house grew still. Minutes passed, each as long as a heartbeat. Then the sharp crack of a shot split the air. Reed leapt to his feet, but Miss Marple did not flinch. She only closed her eyes and whispered, "So ends pride." They found Daphne kneeling by the chair, sobbing, her father's hand still clasped in hers. The pistol lay fallen to the floor. Reed motioned for the constable, but Miss Marple stepped forward first, lifting the girl gently away. "Come, child," she murmured. "Let him rest." The coroner came later. The necessary forms were filled, and the village once again prepared to close its shutters around the tragedy. Yet Miss Marple knew it would not be so simple. Deaths leave ripples, and some linger longer than the mourners expect. That night as she returned home, she passed the churchyard. The mist clung low over the stones, curling around the names of the forgotten. She paused beneath the yew, the same bench where Daphne had once sat. The air was cold but clear now, and the stars shone dimly through the haze. Inspector Reed found her there a few minutes later, his coat collar turned up. "It's over," he said quietly. "The case, the statements, all of it." Miss Marple shook her head. "Not over, Inspector. Just complete. The village will talk for months. Gossip is our way of understanding evil, without calling it by name. But for those involved, the Finch woman, the daughter, even Tom Simmons, time will take what punishment cannot." Reed looked at her curiously. "And you? What do you take from it?" She smiled faintly, her breath a wisp in the cold. "Only confirmation. That wickedness is rarely monstrous, Inspector. It is tidy, polite, and terribly ordinary. That's why we miss it until it's too late." He was silent for a long moment, then said, "I'll never understand how you see so clearly." "Because I listen," she replied softly. "People tell you everything, Inspector. If you let them believe they've told you nothing." They stood in silence a while longer, the fog curling around them like old lace. When at last she turned to go, Reed tipped his hat. "Good night, Miss Marple. Good night, Inspector. And remember, truth once found must be tended like a garden. Otherwise it grows wild again." She walked back through the lane toward her cottage, the faint lamplight flickering ahead like the end of a long thread. Behind her, St. Mary Mead slept uneasily, as if aware that beneath its calm hedges and clean curtains, human nature still stirred, restless and unrepentant. The following morning brought a subdued hush to St. Mary Mead, a quiet that seemed to settle more heavily than usual, like the pause between the closing of one chapter and the reluctant turning of the next. The village awoke under a grey sky. Even the birds sounded hesitant, as though uncertain whether to resume their songs. Miss Marple sat by her window, her teacup cooling beside her untouched. Across the lane the baker's boy passed on his morning rounds, his whistle muted. Word of Colonel Somerton's death had spread overnight, seeping through the town like mist creeping under doors. Everyone knew and everyone pretended for decency's sake not to know too quickly. For Miss Marple the conclusion brought no satisfaction, only the hollow quiet that followed truth too long pursued. The colonel had fulfilled her grim expectation. His final act, she thought, was both confession and punishment. Yet in that act, a faint dissonance remained, something unsettled, a shadow on the pattern she had so carefully traced. When evil ends abruptly, she often reminded herself, it leaves behind its echo. And echoes have a way of carrying what was missed the first time. She was still turning this thought over, when Inspector Reed appeared at her door once again, hat in hand, his expression grim but not unkind. He looked older than he had the night before. "I thought you'd want to know, Miss Marple," he began. "We've closed the formal inquiry. Suicide, naturally. The note confirms all that was said. But there's a loose thread that keeps tugging at me." Miss Marple gestured toward the hearth where the fire had burned low. "Loose threads, Inspector, are the most instructive kind. Do sit down before it unravels entirely." He took her invitation, warming his hands over the embers. "It's this," he said finally. "The pistol, the one the colonel used. It wasn't his service revolver. It was registered to someone else. To Mr. Davies." Her knitting needles paused mid-air. "Ah," she said softly. So the schoolmaster's connection wasn't quite finished. Precisely, Reed replied. Davies swears the weapon was stolen from his drawer at school. He filed no report because he thought he'd misplaced it. Didn't want to cause fuss. He claims he lent it once, long ago, to the colonel, who admired its craftsmanship, but that seems unlikely. The colonel would never use another man's gun when his own sat locked in the cabinet. Miss Marple considered that. Unless he wished the manner of his death to point elsewhere, to suggest some other story or to conceal one. Reed frowned. You think there's more to it? I think, she said, that human beings rarely act for a single reason. A man like Colonel Somerton could not bear shame. Yet he also could not leave a narrative untidy. He has arranged even his death to tidy up appearances. The inspector's eyes narrowed. You mean to protect someone? Perhaps, or perhaps to correct an injustice he believed he'd caused. She set her knitting aside. The colonel was methodical. He may have written a confession, but he may also have written something else. A letter, perhaps. Did you find anything beyond the one on his desk? Reed shook his head. Nothing. His handwriting's unmistakable, and we searched the drawers. Miss Marple rose, moving to the window. Men like the colonel do not hide what they wish to keep. They place it exactly where no one will think to question its belonging. Did you check the photograph frame on his mantelpiece? The one of his late wife? No, then do, she said gently. He looked at her face every day. It would have seemed to him the safest listener. By afternoon the inspector was back, a folded sheet in his hand, its edges browned from long concealment behind the photograph's backing. His eyes carried the faint astonishment of a man whose doubts had just been rewarded. You were right. Another note, dated the night before he died. He passed it to her carefully. You should read it. Miss Marple opened it with delicate precision, scanning the neat, firm script. To whoever cares for truth rather than comfort, I did not kill Elford. I believed I might, but belief and action are not the same. He died by another's hand, someone who knew what I intended and hastened the result. The cup was poured before I touched it. There was mercy in it, I think, though I do not know whose. She lowered the paper, her expression unreadable. He doubted himself at the end. That at least is honest. Reed exhaled slowly. So we're back to mystery. If he didn't poison Elford, who did? Mrs. Finch was locked away. The daughter had no access. Davies was at the school. That leaves no one. Miss Marple smiled faintly. On the contrary, Inspector, it leaves everyone. When guilt is shared, each believes themselves innocent because the act seems diluted by necessity. Yet one person must always pour the cup. She tapped the letter thoughtfully. Elford was arrogant, yes, but he was also careless. He met many that day, financiers, workers, even the vicar, who came about a repair for the church motor. Suppose in the midst of all that, someone else heard his threats. Someone who'd lost more to his dealings than pride? Reed's brow furrowed. You mean Tom Simmons? But the lad, no, he had neither the nerve nor the means. No, she agreed, not Tom, he's too simple for deceit. But perhaps someone speaking for him, someone protective. The village thrives on small loyalties, Inspector, and one cannot guard a secret forever without acting upon it. Reed studied her, then understanding began to dawn. The vicar's maid, he said quietly. She's his cousin. You think she helped, Miss Marple finished. Not out of malice, but from fear. She knew Tom would be blamed for Lily's death. She knew Elford had been making inquiries. When she saw him drink tea that morning, she might have thought to finish what others began, to prevent him from destroying yet another life. Reed rubbed his temples. A servant girl killing a man to protect her kin. God help us, it fits. Miss Marple's voice softened. Goodness and wickedness are never far apart, Inspector. One trips into the other more easily than people believe. Still, I may be wrong, but perhaps it's better for her sake if no one looks too closely now. Justice has already taken its toll, and the innocent have suffered enough. Reed looked torn. You'd have me leave it. A death unanswered? She met his eyes with quiet conviction. Her death answered too fully, Inspector. May ruin the living beyond repair. The law seeks guilt. I seek understanding. Between them there must be mercy. He said nothing for a while, only staring at the folded letter in his hands. The fire crackled softly between them, its warmth at odds with the cold beyond the walls. Finally he sighed. You're right, I suppose. We've punished the guilty, though perhaps not the right ones. But it's done. The file will close. Miss Marple smiled sadly. Files close, Inspector, but hearts seldom do. When he left, twilight had already deepened. She stood by the window, watching as his figure disappeared into the fog, then turned back to her table. The objects she'd gathered, the scrap of linen, the cup handle, the letter, all lay there still, mute witnesses to folly and frailty. She gathered them up carefully and placed them in a small wooden box. As she fastened the latch, she spoke softly to the empty room. It's never really about murder, she said. It's about people, about what fear makes of them and what love allows. Outside, the fog thickened again, cloaking the lanes and cottages in pale mystery. The church bell tolled 8 times, slow and measured, each note fading into the next, like the quiet echo of a story that had finished telling itself. Though in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple knew no story ever truly ended. It merely waited, polite and patient, for the next cup of tea. The day after the Colonel's burial was windless, hedges crisp as if someone had trimmed the morning to an edge. St. Mary Mead resumed its rituals, milk at doors, gossip under breath. But the village moved as one does after a fever, testing each step. Miss Marple set out with a small parcel and a decision she had been stitching since the night of the pistol. Truth sometimes comes if given a chair and a cup. Inspector Reed met her at the school gate, summoned by a note in her tidy hand. So you've a plan, he said. Only a tea, Miss Marple replied. On the back bench of Mr. Davies's classroom, Miss Marple laid her parcel, a tray, 2 cups, a sugar basin, a little kettle borrowed from the vicarage. The schoolmaster came at her request. You wanted my assistance, Mrs. Marple. Only your instruction, she said. Show me how a considerate host sets a tray for a left-handed drinker. I muddle my handles. He hesitated, then complied. With absent competence, he turned each handle to 9 o'clock, set the spoon left, drew the sugar where a left thumb would find it. When he had finished, Miss Marple merely nodded. And if you wish to sweeten the first sip without troubling your guest. He reached for the spoon, then stopped. I would perhaps dissolve sugar in the cup beforehand. We are all children when confronted with our habits, Miss Marple said. Tell me, did you call on Mr. Elford the morning he died? No, he said too quickly. Reed opened a notebook. Your pupils confirm you dismissed them early. The foreman recalls a gentleman with spectacles in Elford's corridor shortly before Miss Daphne arrived. Davies's throat worked. I looked in to ask about a subscription for the school fund. He was out. I only set the tray to be helpful. The left-hand tray, Miss Marple said gently. He stared at her, understanding dawning. I did not mean... He swallowed. I thought only to deter him. A drop brushed inside the lip. I had read that air dulls it. I believed it would lose its edge in minutes, that if he delayed it would be harmless. I am a coward. Cowards use time like a shield. And the drop. His voice became a thread. From the vicar's cupboard. The key lay on the study table one evening, she told me, and I borrowed it again for lantern slides, I said. She is kind, and I took advantage of kindness. The back door opened on that word. The vicar's maid stood there, hands tight in her apron. Miss Marple had sent for her, too. The girl took 2 steps and stopped, her eyes on Davies with the troubled devotion of someone who knows both worst and best. I gave him the key, she said before Reed could speak. He asked it for the children. I thought, if Mr. Elford didn't drink, or if he mended his ways, nothing would come of it. When I heard he'd died, I thought God had answered our trouble. Then I saw Miss Daphne cry, and I knew God hadn't needed me at all. Silence settled. Reed closed his notebook. You see, she said softly, how people make triangles out of straight roads. He feared exposure and being despised by his pupils. She feared losing her cousin to a gallows. Each told a story in which the least action would set the world to rights. The world obeyed the physics of poison instead. Davies lifted his hands as if surrendering. If Miss Daphne had been 5 minutes later, he whispered, or if Elford had argued first, then another would have died another day, Miss Marple said. You gambled with life and called it delay. Reed's face had gone bleak. Mr. Davies, I must— Inspector, Miss Marple interposed. You will do as the law demands. Permit me one question more. She turned to the schoolmaster. Why coat the lip and not the sugar? He answered without thinking. Because I could wipe it away if courage returned. He covered his face. The maid made a small sound and stepped toward him, but Reed lifted a hand and she halted. I shall come, Davies said. I will not ask for kindness. They walked him out by the quiet door to spare the children a parade. When the latch fell, the maid leaned against a desk and wept. Miss Marple stood beside her until the worst had passed. I thought I was helping, the girl managed. Mrs. Finch said sacrifice proves love. I thought a small wrong to stop a great one. Sacrifice, Miss Marple said, is only love when freely given by the one who pays. Be careful when you spend other people. The girl nodded. I'll tell the truth, she whispered. By afternoon the village had done what villages do. It had half heard and half guessed and fully decided. A schoolmaster in handcuffs, a faithful maid who lent a key, a housekeeper who mistook order for goodness, a colonel who tried to stand between his name and the abyss and fell in. Inspector Reed came to Miss Marple's parlour at dusk. He looked emptied out. He signed, he said, a statement without embroidery. The maid corroborated the key. The chemist confirms the missing measure. The foreman remembers a gloved hand adjusting the tray. And Tom, Miss Marple asked, released with an apology that satisfies no one. Reed sank into a chair. You were right in everything, and I hate that you were. She poured tea. You do not hate it. You hate that the right thing hurts nearly as much as the wrong. She set a cup by his hand. Often, she said, when he asked if she tired of being right. It keeps one from surprise. After a moment, she added, there will be leniency, I think. Not from the law, but from time. A conscience like Mr. Davies's is a cell no jailer can better. Reed stared into his cup. It seems grotesque that so many suffered because a fretted man touched a cup. We build our prisons out of trifles, Miss Marple said. The turned handle, a letter kept, a silence mistaken for mercy. He set down his cup and rose. I'll send word when the Crown is finished with us. We shall forget in part, Miss Marple said. If we did in whole, we should be due to repeat it. After he had gone, evening folded itself over the village. Miss Marple tidied her tray and put away the little kettle. She pinned a slip above her mantle, 2 words she had written before things became clear, and which still seemed the best epitaph for the affair. Intention, accident. Then she unpinned it, folded it once and slipped it into her box with the chipped handle and the scrap of linen. She took her knitting to the window and watched the first star appear. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere a latch lifted. Miss Marple counted stitches and let the village settle around her. Its little loves, its tidy cruelties, its teacups set for left and right. When the clock chimed 8, she smiled, blew out the lamp and left the fire to husband itself. Quiet, complete, and earned. Today. The trial of Mr. Davies never came to pass. Before the court could summon him to London, a quiet agreement was reached. An acknowledgment, perhaps, that no punishment devised by man could rival the slow gnawing of remorse. He remained at St. Mary Mead for several months, teaching until a replacement was found, walking each morning with a bowed head past the churchyard where Lily Price now rested. His resignation letter, written in an unsteady hand, contained only one sentence: I shall not teach children until I learn myself the meaning of responsibility. Mrs. Finch was released soon after. Though formally cleared of murder, her pride had been broken as surely as her position. She returned to her sister in Bath, where she was said to keep a lodging-house of such rigid propriety that guests found it almost impossible to stay. Tom Simmons, once so easily condemned, left St. Mary Mead for a gardener's post in Devon. He wrote to the vicar's maid once, thanking her for her courage, and never wrote again. As for Miss Daphne Somerton, she inherited her father's house but not his illusions. She lived there alone for a time. Her beauty subdued, her gaiety gentled into reflection. Occasionally she sent flowers to the church in Lily's name. No one spoke of her engagement again. Inspector Reed came to Miss Marple's cottage one misty morning, not long after the village had begun to heal. He found her as he always did, knitting by the window, the kettle whispering on the hob, her expression serene yet far away. "It's finished at last," he said, setting his hat on the table. "The papers are satisfied. The Crown's content and the rest of the country has found a new scandal to whisper about. We've had our peace restored." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Peace, yes, but restoration is another matter. What's broken seldom returns to its original shape, Inspector. It becomes something else, sometimes wiser, sometimes merely smaller." Reed sat opposite her, glancing toward the neat rows of geraniums on the sill. "You have a gift, Miss Marple. You make tragedy sound like housekeeping." "Housekeeping," she replied, "is precisely what detection is, Inspector. One tidies away falsehoods, folds up misdirection, and dusts off truths that have been left neglected. Only at the end does one see what the room was meant to look like." He laughed softly. "And this room, this affair, what does it look like now to you?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her tone remained solemn. "It looks like human nature, as it always does. The Colonel's pride, Mrs. Finch's blind devotion, Mr. Davies's fear, the maid's desperate kindness, all of them meant well in their own ways. But meaning well has caused more mischief in this world than deliberate wickedness ever could. People mistake their motives for their morals, and that is where tragedy begins." Reed nodded slowly. "And you, Miss Marple, do you never tire of finding these things out? Of seeing what's hidden in people's hearts?" She folded her knitting neatly in her lap. "Oh, I tire, Inspector, but I remind myself that understanding evil doesn't mean excusing it. It only means recognizing it for what it is. Ordinary, familiar, and most of all preventable, if one only looks closely enough." Outside, the church bells began to toll the hour. Their echoes rippled over the village, over tidy gardens, narrow lanes, and the stillness that follows after secrets have been spent. Miss Marple rose and crossed to the window, gazing out across the rooftops dusted with soft sunlight. A child's laughter drifted from the green, and a milk cart rattled down the lane. Life, unashamed and untroubled, was beginning again. "I sometimes think," she said quietly, "that every murder is less about the taking of a life than about the forgetting of one. People forget kindness, patience, the small courtesies that hold a community together. And when enough forgetting gathers in one place, something terrible happens to remind us." Reed followed her gaze. "Perhaps that's what you do, Miss Marple, remind us." She smiled, her eyes still on the street. "Then I should hope to be unnecessary some day." He took his leave soon after, his step lighter as he walked down the lane. Miss Marple remained at the window until his figure disappeared into the haze. Then she turned back to her fire, took from the mantel the small wooden box she had kept since the beginning, and opened it. Inside lay the remnants of the case, the scrap of linen, the broken cup handle, the folded letter, and the note she had once written to herself, "Intention. Accident." She read the words again, nodding faintly. "And sometimes," she murmured, "the difference between the two is only a moment's hesitation." Replacing the note, she closed the lid and set the box gently back in its place. The kettle whistled, and she poured herself a cup of tea, the steam curling upward like a blessing. Outside, a sparrow fluttered onto the sill, peering in as though to see whether all was indeed right with the world. Miss Marple lifted her cup toward it with a small smile. "Yes, my dear," she said softly. "For now, at least." The bird gave a brief, approving chirp before darting away into the morning, and Miss Marple, the quiet guardian of St. Mary Mead, returned to her knitting as the clock ticked on, steady, patient, and eternal, much like the lady herself, and in that tranquil rhythm of needles and time, the village resumed its ordinary life, though beneath its peaceful surface. As Miss Marple well knew, the endless weave of human frailty and folly continued, waiting only for the next dropped stitch to begin another story.